12 Monkeys tells the story of James Cole, one of the few remaining survivors of a viral pandemic that forced the human race underground, where he now lives as a slave under a ruling scientific elite desperate to reclaim the planet's surface. The scientists choose James to man the front lines of their experimental time travel program, sending him 3 decades in the past, to 1996, with a mission to investigate the source of the deadly virus, retrieve a sample, and bring it back to the future for a cure. Even though James knows that the past itself can never be changed, that the timeline is unbreakable, he can't help but become completely entangled within it. He grows more and more attached and ultimately falls in love. This leads him to attempt to change the course of history, but instead James meets a tragic end, in an event that he himself witnessed as a child a long time ago. An event so beyond his comprehension that he's condemned to repeat it over and over again, in a never-ending loop. Still, just like this story hinges on the possibility of finding a cure within the disease, it also tells us that hidden within the tragedy itself is a map that can lead the way out. Primarily, 12 Monkeys is a film about the mind. More precisely, about the relationship between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And it uses the planet, or the globe, as a metaphor for the mind.
Where they created this model of my mind. Yes! Where they created this model of my mind.
It's within the globe itself, inside the Globe Hotel, where James is taken for psychoanalysis to retrieve important truths from his mind. Many more references to the planet keep on repeating themselves throughout the movie, usually as mentions of either the planet's surface or its underground.
And possibly play an important role in returning the human race to the surface of the Earth.
I just want to do my part to get us back on top in charge of the planet.
As a resident of the underground, continuously seeking to access the planet's surface, James Cole represents the subconscious mind that seeks to communicate with the conscious mind. Up on the surface, we find, representing the conscious mind, Catherine Riley, James' psychiatrist. Her goal as a psychiatrist is to access and communicate with the subconscious mind. Initially, each of them thinks that the other is living in a dream world. For James, Catherine's world is destined to die, and so is she, which makes her basically just a means to an end. While from Catherine's perspective, James is a delusional schizophrenic who's constructed a completely fake reality for himself. He's a sick man in need of serious help. Both James and Catherine are convinced that their own version of reality is the only possible one. The more Catherine has control of the narrative, the more James is restrained. And the more James has control of the narrative, the more Catherine is restrained. What neither of them realizes is that both narratives tell the same story. It's the same story, only told from 2 different perspectives. A fact that becomes clear when we compare James' life in the underground next to his life on the surface. Like James waking from a dream in the underground, and then waking up from the same dream above ground. James's only friend underground, and his only friend above. James showering underground, and showering above. James being restrained in a gurney underground, and being restrained in a gurney above. Inoculation underground, and inoculation above. Locked in a cell underground, and locked in a cell above. Marched in handcuffs underground, and marched in handcuffs above. Ordered released underground, and ordered released above. sitting before a panel of scientists underground, and sitting before a panel of scientists above. Under, above, under, above, under, above, and so on. This might just mean that James really is delusional, that he is in fact living as a patient in a psych ward, and that his mind is simply filtering his real-world experiences of being continuously poked and prodded and experimented on by mostly uncaring doctors into a more romantic and exciting version of reality. One where he's been put in charge of saving the future of the entire human race, all the while falling in love with his beautiful psychiatress. There to reinforce this more romantic version of reality is Jeffrey Goins, who plays the role of the trickster. The trickster who disguises himself as the fool. The trickster, both teller of lies and revealer of truth. The trickster and shapeshifter. The one who possesses the keys to parallel realities. Capable of accessing the deepest regions of the primitive underworld, as well as the higher, more refined realms of human potential. Eventually, the trickster guides James up the spiraling staircase, leading him up the mythological world tree towards higher truth, from where James, unable to accept the accountability that comes with this ascent, quickly plunges back down to the ground, and then back into the chaotic world of the unconscious underground. In the underground, the trickster energy manifests itself to James as a disembodied voice, who tells him how to regain access to the surface. But once James finally does make it back on top, he decides to cut all ties with the underground once and for all by removing his back teeth. The tooth, symbolically speaking, is a lot like the tree, rooting itself in the body like the tree roots itself in the ground.
Cross-section of one of the old trees has been cut down.
Here I was born, and there I died.
A tree needs to grow deep roots in order to reach high into the sky. So when James severs his connection to the subconscious underground, he's also severing his connection to the higher realms, cutting access to the divine part of the self, keeping it bound up and tucked away, hidden in the darker recesses of his psyche. And now he's forced to hide behind a false identity, trying hard to escape his destiny. As much as James tries to redefine his destiny through conscious willpower, the subconscious just keeps on catching up with him. Ironically, cutting his ties from the subconscious has only served to empower the subconscious. Now, minions from the underground are coming up to the surface to find James and force him to follow through on his dubious mission. And before he knows it, the loop has closed back on itself yet again, while he repeats the same familiar tragedy. Witnessing this from the perspective of James the child, we get to see the scars that one event left him with. We're pinpointing that one moment in time when he chose to collapse into the subconscious. That one moment when he began to let outside forces direct him, resigning himself to take a back seat in his own life. That moment when the more primitive functions of the lower mind effectively took over. Only for James to wake up decades later, now a middle-aged man who wonders what happened to his life, How did he get so low? Looking in the mirror, all he sees is a distorted image of what he once was. What was once pure potential now has to hide behind a mask. And is condemned to repeat the same unconscious patterns again and again. If James Cole really is a time traveler from a dystopic future, then there's really nothing he could do. He's but a helpless victim stuck within an unbreakable and tragic time loop. On the other hand, if he's just some guy that happens to be dealing with real-world issues, then there's hope that he could steer himself back on course. By looking deeply within, he could follow the clues and retrace his steps to uncover the source of the unconscious motivations that have been running his life. Through an honest process of self-discovery, he could begin to gauge the abandoned ruins of his psyche, where he might just find a world that's been toppled completely upside down, with the lower forces placed high above on a pedestal, while the spiritual forces are kept repressed below. When James discovers that it's not about breaking free from the loop per se, but rather rearranging the loop, flipping it back to where it once was, right side up, with the opposite but complementary parts of his psyche, the conscious and subconscious, placed as equals under the rulership of the superconscious, then he'll finally begin to envision a future that's positive and wholesome, and within grasp. And so continues the everyday inner work that leads to becoming a more realized and healthy human being.
I don't really come from outer space.